As our attendees are joining, I'd just like to say hi to everybody. I'm Tom Reid and I'm Chief Exec of Leeds City Council. When I first became a Chief Exec, I had somebody who worked with me who told me we were having a meeting with a council who we had to be very annoyed with. I'm not very good at being annoyed sometimes. So my advisor made me be silent after we'd given them our view, and not break the silence until someone else spoke. And the silence lasted 2 minutes. And it's the longest 2 minutes of my life. I just can't do the silence. I've always got to fill in. I'm one of those people. So that's why I've started talking rather than just leave everyone in this horrible silence. But now that we've got everybody joined, we'll make a start. This seminar series between Camden and Leeds is called New Conversations, New Connections. And today we want to talk about lending our voice to securing livelihoods and building a 21st century welfare state. The Camden Leeds connection comes out of a conversation that started with the leaders and chief execs of our respective councils, where we realised that we were very like-minded. We had a shared outlook about, the role and the future of local authorities as innovative organisations who can connect, work with and support improvements in communities. But I think we were very struck by the fact that we were often described very differently. Camden, obviously in London, the world financial capital, a fantastic city, a world city, and some would say the capital of the world. And then Leeds, a northern city, the third biggest city in the country, and one that was very ambitious, but shared a lot of the challenges that the north has. But when you look deeper, you realise that Camden has huge challenges with child poverty, high levels of child poverty. Leeds has huge challenges, but also lots of opportunity and economic success as well. So we're much more, we have much more in common than apart, really. So hence the desire to maybe have a bit of an unlikely partnership and bring in voices to talk about some of those really big issues facing us. And what bigger one is there than this one about the 21st century welfare state? The only thing I was going to say before introducing the speakers, apart from just outlining what we want to discuss today, which is 3 questions really: why we think the existing welfare state is failing those who need it, if COVID presents an opportunity to rethink what that's for, and if so, what a welfare system fit for the 21st century should look like. And the only observation I was going to make at the start was that I think one of the things that the last year has done has brought many more people into requiring support from the state than we probably ever had in the country. People who never expected to have to be in a situation of crisis, people who maybe had a different opinion of the welfare state and the need for intervention by governments before COVID, but maybe have changed their opinion about how the safety net needs to work and how it might work in the future. So trying to take that opportunity. We're really delighted with the people that we have today as our panel, and the panel are going to be chaired incredibly well by my colleague Jenny Rowlands, who's my favourite chief exec in the country, and I hope there's no other chief exec watching, or I'm going to be in big trouble. We have Dame Professor Henrietta Moore, who we're really delighted to have, the founder director of the Institute for Global Prosperity and the chair in Culture, Philosophy and Design at UCL. Henrietta graduated with a PhD from Cambridge and has held various academic posts and set up IGP in 2014, was made a Dame Commander of the British Empire in 2016 for contribution to social sciences, services to business policy and the arts, and her recent work particularly is focused on universal basic services and things like the gender pay gap. Then we have Sapphire Parker, the founder of Little Village, a registered charity launched in 2016, now a director at consultancy The Point People. Sapphire has previously held posts in the Cabinet Office, Demos, Resolution Foundation, NSPC, and Kent County Council. Little Village connect donations and gift them to families dealing with challenging circumstances like homelessness, unemployment, and domestic abuse. And their overall mission is to ensure all children have what they need to thrive. We then have Shanaz Gul, Operations Director at our brilliant Hamara Healthy Living Centre in Leeds, the largest ethnic minority organisation in the city's voluntary and community sector. Shanaz was born and raised in Leeds, a Muslim British Pakistani woman, and her passion was sparked by her involvement in youth and community work from a young age of 14 when she took part in a youth group. As a first female leader of Hamara, Shanaz hopes to inspire many more young women and work towards leadership positions. And Hamara is one of those absolute anchor organisations in our city, providing a diverse range of projects in one of the poorest parts of Leeds, focused on areas including food, health promotion, youth activities, etc. Then we have Councillor Georgia Gould, elected to Camden Council in 2010 at the age of 24. Wow. As leader, Georgia has made tackling injustice and inequality of wealth, income and influence the focus of the council's work. And I saw that at first hand when I led the peer review of Camden. Georgia is also chair of London Councils, which gives us a really good window on the city as a whole, and is the co-chair of the Skills for London Task Force. She has a special interest in the politics and experiences of young people, and has published a book, Wasted: How Misunderstanding Young Britain Threatens Our Future. And that was based on 2 years spent interviewing young people. And last but not least, our new leader, Councillor James Lewis, will join us after about half an hour, recently elected as the leader. He was previously deputy leader since 2015. He's been overseeing finance, human resources, corporate planning, and leading on the tech sector before becoming leader. And before that, he was the chair of our West Yorkshire Integrated Transport Authority, and is the member for one of the Out Awards in Leeds, what you might call one of the sort of former coalfield areas. Leeds is quite an interesting city with a widely drawn boundary. So we have the classic inner city, the city centre, but we also have the wider boundary as well. So I'm really delighted and really looking forward to the discussion, and I will now hand over to Jenny to open the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Tom, and good morning and welcome to everyone. So today we'll start. We're really lucky, as Tom said, to be joined by Professor Dame Henrietta Moore, and she's just going to give us a brief presentation for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to the wider panel. So over to you, Henrietta.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Tom and Jenny, for inviting me. And I'm very pleased to be here. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today and taking part in this event with Camden Council and Leeds City Council, and with a wonderful panel to share the work that we've been doing in what I hope will be a rich and very engaging conversation about new visions of shared prosperity for the 21st century. And I'd like to be able to talk with you and to show what it's possible to achieve through bold and alternative and innovative ways of working together. So for those of you who don't know about the IGP, we are an institute, a multidisciplinary institute, primarily concerned with reimagining and redesigning prosperity for the 21st century. We work in the UK and we work globally. And our current thinking is focused on how to repurpose our economy to deliver quality of life, secure livelihoods, and economic and social well-being for people and the planet. And the theme of today's conversation is secure livelihoods. And secure livelihoods is what we believe is the most important driver of prosperity for the UK going forward. And I'll be talking about the critically important role that public services play in livelihood security and prosperity, and proposing a radical rethink of the welfare system that places what we call universal basic services at its centre. But first, before I get to that, I want to step back a little and think about the challenges we face as a society, and why I believe that only social innovation and a radical rethinking of our priorities can move us forward in a sustainable and inclusive way. So I have Hannah this morning who's helping me with a slide. So Hannah, can I have the next slide, please? So in the post-COVID world, we will face a triple threat, as we all know, of global recession, a rapidly degrading environment, and enduring inequalities, which have only been widened further by the global pandemic. And both Camden and Leeds City Council have been dealing with the fallout from that, as have all councils across the UK. So COVID-19, as I've said, has exacerbated these very stark national and regional inequalities, from access to digital services and housing to educational and health outcomes. And I think we're all aware now that traditional macroeconomic approaches to prosperity building have failed. So models that are centered on economic growth, controlled from Whitehall, fail to secure livelihoods for ordinary people. The modern model wasn't working pre-pandemic, and it certainly won't work to help us build back better. This idea that if we had growth, it would trickle down to everyone just isn't happening. So post-COVID, and in the context of levelling up and building back, as we all like to say now, we have an opportunity for a radically different approach. And that approach involves collectively, so that's working together, all of us, to redefine what we mean by prosperity, to include and to place an emphasis on quality of life for everyone, while taking care of our planet and reformulating policy making to be genuinely inclusive. What we can't afford is another, in my view, another Whitehall programme of repatching and partial reform. We don't need another new shiny initiative. We actually need a radical rethink of how we understand what we mean by the word prosperity. That means how we think about and value the economy and what the economy should do for people. And that means also thinking about the place of the welfare system in the 21st century. Next slide, please, Hannah. So key to that is really understanding that a simplistic focus on income, productivity, and economic growth has really led to policymakers overlooking the significant disparities, the very significant disparities that exist between communities and within them. Deprivation and poverty to continue to be stubbornly unresponsive to current policy interventions for the most part. So to rebuild prosperity, we first have to genuinely understand what prosperity means to people and to places. It will be different everywhere, but it certainly won't be focused on old metrics like GDP. So between 2015 and 2017, the IGP worked with a team of citizen social scientists, that's ordinary community residents from East London, to find out what prosperity meant to them. Interviewing people in 5 neighbourhoods in and around the Olympic Park, we explored and looked at what prevented people from living prosperous lives. How did they see that situation? And what we found was that people consistently said that a secure livelihood was the most important factor in trying to achieve or to underpin people's prosperity in East London. So what was meant by that? Well, what they were saying was that, okay, and a secure income and good quality work are absolutely vital. But what was also important was how livelihood security and the security of everyone in the family depended on several really important overlapping factors. And you had to understand that kind of ecology of factors and the way they came together. So you had to have a reliable and adequate income, but you also had to have affordable and good quality housing. You had to have access to public services. You had to have social and economic inclusion. You had to have voice and participation. You had to have recognition and social care and social solidarity within your communities. So at the IGP, when we speak of livelihood security, we're talking about a whole infrastructure, as I've said, an ecology of services, resources, and participation that contribute to everyone's ability to get by and to lead the life they want. So if we're going to level up, we need to come up with something which is rather more than just well-meaning rhetoric and great phrases. If we're to genuinely create shared prosperity, we have to start by reimagining what the economy is, how value is created in our societies, and how the economy works for society. We have to rebuild the connection between macroeconomics and the socioeconomic realities that citizens actually live with and struggle with daily, and recognize that those differ across and within communities. So this is why at the IGP, we really are calling at the moment for secure livelihoods to be at the center of any kind of action for levelling up and recovery planning post-pandemic. So can I have the next slide, please, Hannah? So long before COVID-19 struck, the welfare system was struggling, as we all know, to respond to the challenges of the 21st century. It was struggling to respond to the social care crisis, to the climate emergency, to the unequal impact of new technologies and automation on jobs and wages. And as the pandemic unfolded, the need for a new concept of what we might term universality emerged, one that could effectively approach the problem of social inequalities in a new way and start to underpin this new vision of prosperity that we've talked about. Now, the current parameters for universal services and for the welfare state as we know it were forged as the world struggled to recover from the trauma of World War II. And they were built on principles of solidarity, of collective responsibility and shared needs. And those, of course, are the principles that underpin the UK's existing offer of health and education as universal services. But while those two services are critical, they're not sufficient, nowhere near sufficient to address the many challenges that communities are now facing in the 21st century. And we do need to rethink what our public services are for the lived experience of the 21st century. A 21st century welfare system needs to acknowledge that health, education, employment, and poverty are not issues that are experienced in isolation, but are inextricably linked together and actually in many places and spaces form very, very knotty problems. So what we're suggesting is that an effective welfare system for the 21st century must be expanded to include new services essential to modern lives as we live them now, such as adult and child care, food security, digital access and transportation. And this new bundle of public services is what we have called universal basic services. So universal basic services, or UBS, is a universal provision of a set of public services that are designed to enhance people's capacities and capabilities to respond not only to today's challenges, but to the future challenges which are coming down the line. So the IGP has been working with our partners at Camden Council to explore the options for this universal provision of key public services. And we've been looking together at digital services and transport. And the idea is to enable access, to use these services to enable access to economic opportunity and to civic participation and to forms of enhanced social care and social solidarity within communities across Camden. So as part of what's called the Good Work Camden project, we prototyped 2 UBS programs on internet connectivity and transport. And these prototypes demonstrated very well the benefits of a more holistic, connected service offer, showing very positive impacts on mental well-being, access to services, and the ability to look for work. And the results from these experiments, if you like, made it very, very clear that with regard to work, employment support is not enough to help build a secure livelihood. What is required is this set of connected services that enable people to participate in a broader way, both socially and economically. And so that's why I would really like to see local authorities right across the UK and housing providers and other kinds of organisations starting to experiment with universal basic services. Can I have the next slide, please, Hannah? So one of the things we really think is important in this regard is you can't build this new set of public services without people leading on their co-design and leading on the new formulation of policy making. The people whose prosperity you're aiming to improve have to be involved in that policy making. That's a very clear understanding. And so what the IGP has done is we've pioneered the development of the UK's first citizen-led prosperity index. That's a new way of defining and measuring and acting to create shared prosperity. Because if policymakers don't know what shared prosperity means for those people whose quality of life they are trying to enhance, then it's surely inevitable that they will miss the mark. Now, the Prosperity Index is based on the theory, and it's not really a theory, it's a practice, that new kinds of shared knowledge help us to drive social innovation and real change at the local level through new collaborations, through better policy, through more effective outcomes, and through increased trust and capacity. So Hannah, can you show the next slide, which is an image of the Prosperity Index for East London? So what we found in our work, right across the 5 boroughs that we've been working in East London, is that the Prosperity Index allows us to drive real change. It creates shared knowledge that allows citizens, local government, businesses, and community organizations to collaborate, to make decisions, to trial radical new approaches, and to rapidly evaluate change. So we're calling for a set of citizen-led prosperity indices as a new way of governing places and linking local priorities to policy making, to add value to and to manage the UK economy in a new way. We want to bring people into policy making, address the democratic deficit that exists, and create prosperity measures and policies that reflect the lived experience of people and local communities. Can I have the next slide, please, Hannah? So what we want to do is to share it out, to think about how we can deliver together an economy of belonging, a new way of thinking about, as I've suggested, what the economy does for people, and incorporated within that a new way of collaborative decision-making to create secure livelihoods and shared prosperity for people everywhere. If we start now, by the time of the next general election in 2024, every city and every area of the UK could have its own secure livelihood strategy, its own citizen-led prosperity index, and its own set of pathways to levelling up based on local experiences. And central government could, if it was willing, have scoped out and begun to deliver universal basic services to provide the framework for successful local innovations, because local innovation is what this is about. But to do this, as I've said, we need new ways of thinking and acting. Policymakers must understand lived realities in order to know where and how to intervene to improve quality of life and prosperity for 21st century citizens. And by understanding what prosperity means, policymakers will be better placed to map successful pathways to prosperity for different places. Can I have the next slide, please, Hannah? So in conclusion, I'd like to make a bit of a call to action for the UK. We can't hope to level up and deal with the growing divide in poverty and prosperity until we cure our fetish of running extractive economies based on metrics that no longer work for us, like GDP. We have to accept the failure of current policy making and the failure of fixes to the current system, and to take into account the decline in civic and political participation, which is broad across the country, although of course we saw a great uprising of it during the time of the pandemic, which we're still living through. I really want to stress today that in my view, we can't build prosperity in the 21st century based on ideas from the early 20th century. Rebuilding prosperity post-COVID will require the kind of vision and commitment and courage that informed the national conversation in the 1940s and led to the creation of the National Health Service. But it will only work if combined with this redefined understanding of the prosperity we want based on quality of life, combined with a concerted effort to address social connection and cohesion, and a reworking of participatory democracy that creates a sense of civic responsibility and partnership between citizens and policymakers, which I know is at the heart of the work that Camden Council and Leeds City Council are already doing. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And I'm really looking forward to it. And so thank you all very much indeed. That's it.
Professor Henrietta, thank you so much. I think there's nothing better for us than a national call to action on a Thursday morning to get us thinking. I mean, I know as a chief exec in a local authority, I think one of the really big challenges to us as local authorities is for us to look at how we need to radically change, really to meet what we talk about the exceptional mobilization of communities during the pandemic as well. So I thought that your points around kind of power and voice and influence challenge us as well in our everyday decision making. Our panels, what we're going to do is actually hear from a couple of our panel, really more from the community perspective, and then we'll come to Georgia. So Shanaz, would you like to perhaps start us off with your experiences in Leeds around the Hamara Healthy Living Centre?
Thank you, Jenny. Yes, of course. Thank you for inviting me today to speak. And thank you, Professor Henrietta. That was absolutely amazing, and completely agree with so many points on there. And we've had a lot of information from our service users and community talking about those basic needs being a priority and ensuring that that's what makes them feel comfortable and secure. So Hamara Healthy Living Centre, we've been a food bank for the last 6 years, and we originally set up as a food bank to support destitute migrants, but that quickly turned to supporting people in working poverty, and it was roughly around 30 people a week that we used to support pre the pandemic. Since the pandemic, we are currently supporting, on a Monday morning, we can have about 67 families waiting at our door for a food parcel. From Tuesday to Friday, you're looking at anything between 40 and 45, and these are different families every single week. Leeds' response has been absolutely amazing, I think, in regards to food. We are one of the 27 food hubs across the city for Middleton Belle Isle, as well as supporting our existing beneficiaries in the local area of Beeston. And there's Leeds Welfare Support Service provides a helpline for people to call in. People who are vulnerable and shielding at home, they can call for prescription collection, for shopping, for whatever kind of basic needs that they need, and we go out and provide that support. In addition to this, since May last year, we've been a cultural hub for the city, providing culturally appropriate food. And what we did was we consulted with community leaders who are on the ground from different ethnicities. So we provide 5 different culturally appropriate food parcels: African, Caribbean, Middle Eastern, South Asian and Eastern European. And this is a provision that wasn't available prior to recognising this need, and was working collaboratively with Leeds City Council to get this provision out across the city. We're currently working with 25 organisations who access this service, and they collect weekly anything between 30 and 60 parcels each per organisation. So that's way over 1,000 families that we're supporting per week. And we've had to, and it's not just the basic need of food, the feedback that we've had in regards to the welfare system is inaccessible, it's not inclusive, it's really, really difficult to navigate the system. Even with everything going online, it makes everything so much more harder. I had a colleague explained to me that he was working with one service user for 3 weeks just to get proof of identification, and they sent ID, they sent proof of address, and 3 weeks later they asked for a photo ID for them to stand next to their passport with a headshot with holding their passport, and it, you know, like they're made to feel like a criminal. And this individual was working prior to the pandemic, who lost their job, and this is their first experience of having to access and navigate the welfare system. Communities are struggling. I think it's an immense amount of pressure on the council, on VCS organisations, and being able to navigate the system, to make a system so difficult when you need to support so many people as well. The process is a lot longer than what it should be. We are a massive advocate of the 5 Ways to Wellbeing model. So in addition to supporting people navigate the welfare system and making sure that they get the benefits they need, we are really keen on building their resilience, and we recognise that health and wellbeing is key. So all of our services at the minute are online, so youth, health, older people, we do education, employment, training, enterprise. It has been really, really difficult to meet people face to face because of the current pandemic, so it's been extremely difficult. So we've had to think of new innovative ways to build that engagement, and the key to that is building trust and a relationship with that individual. And if you can't do that in the current climate, how are we supposed to deliver that support? How are we supposed to help our communities get out of this welfare system that makes them stay in the situation? It doesn't help them to come out of it currently. So the feedback that I've had from my team, that it's not inclusive, it excludes the most vulnerable. Our communities have multiple complex needs. They don't know how to claim, and they don't know what they're entitled to. A lot of individuals are in fear of not being able to get work and part-time work. It's not feasible for them to come off benefits to go for part-time work, that they don't know if it's going to be long-term or not. A lot of our beneficiaries work cash in hand and are paid under minimum wage and really exploited because they can't cover their rent, their basic food and their bills. So we have, as a city, have been working really, I think we've been very forward thinking and working innovatively and working collaboratively with other VCSs. We've created hubs where we meet weekly, we discuss what the issues are, we share resources, and we speak to one another to overcome those barriers and tackle it head on collectively. And I think the city has worked really restoratively to provide high support with high challenge, and looking at what our assets are across the city and supporting one another. We've seen lots of new communities of interest come in, forming their own CICs because they feel let down by their system. They feel like they need to set up their own organisation and deliver the service that they feel that their communities need. They know their needs, they know their culture, they know their barriers, they know best how to deliver that support. And us as key anchors and more experienced organisations need to support these smaller organisations to support their communities. Thank you.
Oh, Shanaz, thank you for that. I should have said we've got plenty of time at the end for questions from people listening in. So do send your questions in through the Q&A opportunity because we are raising a lot of thought-provoking ideas as we work with our panelists. So I'm going to move to Sapphire now from Little Village, just to give us a kind of Camden perspective of what's been happening and her observations. Sapphire.
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. We love Little Village. We love working in Camden. We also work across the whole of London, but Camden is our favourite borough to work with. Don't tell anyone else. And it's brilliant to hear Professor Moore's presentation, and there's so much of what you said there that I was kind of nodding away at and agreeing with, and I think you really managed to kind of frame this discussion so well that we can't really think about welfare, the welfare state or services without understanding its purpose. And I think that purpose is fundamentally changing from you know, where we were in the 1940s to where we are now, that actually, you know, it's not about growth and a rising tide lifting all boats. It's about thinking about what does thriving look like where no one is left behind, and where prosperity is framed in a way that looks after our planet as well as our people. So I think there's a fundamental shift of purpose. Anyway, I mean, so yeah, so I set up Little Village in 2016, and we are like a food bank, but for baby clothes and toys and equipment. As you can probably guess from the name, for us, it's always been about much more than handing stuff out, important though that is. So we talk about the items that we give out. They're all donated by other members of the community. We talk about them as gifts given with love from one family to another. And really what we're trying to do with Little Village is build an infrastructure, a social infrastructure that enables families to help one another. Because we think, particularly when you have a small child, the sense of solidarity and the connection with other families is very high. The sense of this is a really difficult, challenging time is one that is shared, and the desire for all of us to help each other and give every child the best possible start in life is strong. So really that's what we're trying to do with Little Village, as well as the donations and the kits that we give out, and we do give out a lot. We've given out about £5 million worth of stuff over the last 5 years to over 11,000 children. As well as that, we really are working hard to build community. We've got very active volunteer pool, and also to, I guess, raise the profile around child poverty in order to increase the pressure to actually treat this as the national disaster that I really think it is now. I think what's very clear from where I'm sitting and the work that we do at Little Village is that, you know, the welfare state in its current form has not been designed with modern life in mind. It is built on a foundation of unpaid female work, care work, and that is not where we are now. If you look at poverty now, in many cases, the second earner in a family, mainly the women, their salaries, their wages are the difference between a family being in poverty and a family staying afloat. Families need a second income at the moment to stay afloat. We might think it might be better for parents to stay at home and raise their children. I'm not sort of getting into that, but all I'm saying is that actually what we see at Little Village is many families coming and struggling because they simply can't get the hours that they need to stay afloat when they have a young child at home, and childcare is expensive, non-existent, too hard to come by. So I think there is a real problem we've got here, that, you know, the welfare state was not designed to cope with family structures as they are now, nor is it designed to cope with the way jobs are now. So many of the families we support are in, you know, what you might call the gig economy. Many of them are, as Shanaz was saying, cash in hand. It's very, very informal work, labour market, where insecurity is a defining feature. It's a constant struggle for hours, uncertainty about hours from one week to the next, which the welfare system just cannot cope with, and also a total absence of progression. So, you know, these are jobs, not careers, and that I think can be very difficult for people. As a result of all of that, Little Village published a report earlier this year. We worked with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to take a look at what's happening to child poverty specifically for the under fives, and it was very sobering findings. We found that families where there is a child under 3 are at the greatest risk of poverty. We found that families where there is a child under 3 is seeing poverty rising fastest. It's rising for all children. We're on track to see 5.2 million children in poverty within the next 4 years, which I just find completely unacceptable. But yeah, so for the youngest children, yeah, it's rising fastest, and it's also the most persistent. So these precious early years, these children whose lives we're seeing now, you know, the die has been cast for them. You know, it makes it so much harder for children to thrive later when they've struggled in the early years. You know, it makes it much harder to achieve good employment outcomes, good educational outcomes. You know, it shortens lives. So the fact that we are unable to respond and support to family structures as they are now, the fact that we're unable to support the way the jobs market works now, I think is really problematic, and it does really show up in this vital need, I think, as Professor Moore has set out, to think much more radically about what is needed now to create secure livelihoods. The only other thing I'd like to add is just to Shanaz's point about, I think it's so important that we think about resilience and thriving. Again, I think the welfare state was designed at a time to kind of help people in the bad patches. And I think that's very different to what we're talking about here, where we're talking about something that's much more positive and active, when we're talking about people moving towards, you know, having resilience to cope, but also thriving. And I think that it's just worth maybe kind of be interesting to draw those distinctions out in the discussion maybe.
Fantastic, thanks, Sapphire. And yeah, that was a really important point, I think, around thriving. Let's bring in Georgia. We're getting some great questions in the Q&A, so keep them coming. But Georgia Gould will maybe give a bit of a context around some of the comments around what Camden's aspirations are in our work around universal basic services and our reflections on the pandemic. Georgia.
Thank you so much. And it was just amazing to hear all three speakers. And it does feel like there's a kind of powerful movement for change happening. And the one thing the pandemic has done is created a real conversation about inequality and poverty, and particularly race inequality. And I think it's critical that we are having these conversations, and that there is that so many who who'd never, as I think Shanaz said, had never had to kind of interact before with the welfare system, have had to see that it's just completely inadequate. And I was kind of reflecting on what everyone's saying and some of the work we're doing in Camden. It feels like increasingly we are running a shadow welfare state with councils and communities where we are picking up the cracks in the national system. You know, we've distributed in Camden over the pandemic over 280,000 meals, and the kind of, I know Leeds and councils around the country have had to kind of step in around food. But also we have all sorts of discretionary pots of money where we can support some people to when they're in an emergency. And we're now having over 100 calls a day with people who are in desperate need, whether that's for food or for financial support. And the people that come to the council, I think, are those who are really at a desperate point. Our community networks have many more coming forward. So I mean, the system is fundamentally failing people if there is such a huge need for support from elsewhere, and for organisations like both of yours that are doing amazing work, but actually shouldn't be necessary, because people should be supported in their kind of basic needs as part of our society and as part of the welfare state. And I think that the other thing we hear kind of time and time again is how difficult it is to really interact with a welfare state. And I think, Shanaz, you talked about this, how dehumanizing it can feel. You know, I speak to a lot of young people who talk about that experience of kind of ripping hope out of their hearts, and that they, instead of looking at the strengths and everything that they can contribute, it doesn't take any kind of personalized approach, but just kind of forces them into a system that isn't really about them as people. And it not only doesn't meet people's needs, it seems to be based on a deficit model, rather than one that kind of builds on the strengths of individuals and treats people with humanity. And everything that I think Henrietta's work has brought forward, and all the work we've been doing in partnership with the IGP, a similar piece of work around a wellbeing index to understand from our residents' perspective what wellbeing and thriving looks like. And so the things around power and belonging and connection and feeling seen and empowered are so critical to how people interact with services in their lives, and they are just as important to people as security. So how we give support really matters. And I think that's why the work that is often done by our communities is so important, because it starts with where people are, it builds relationships, it's done with love, and I don't think love is a word we use enough in the public sector, and it builds from where people are. And I think the universal basic services model that we've been testing in Camden is a really strong way to create that system, because it works with people about what are the barriers for them. Is it transport or childcare? What do we need to, or shelter? What do we need to put in place to mean that individual can thrive? And I was saying this last night to Henrietta, but we had a conversation that really helped me to frame it about the NHS, that when you go into the NHS, if you go in with a broken leg, you get a different treatment than a heart problem. And actually we can, as a system, be responsive and relational and work with people about what their needs are, but still see those as basic rights. And I'm deeply excited about the work we're doing around universal basic services. We've done some work with transport, and we're just doing a slightly bigger trial now around digital access. Digital access has been so critical during the pandemic. We've seen children cut out from their right to education through lack of digital access, and increasingly as things move online, as Sapphire was talking about, we're seeing that as a route into services and employment. So, what would it look like if we gave people that digital access and the skills they need to do that, and how would that change people's lives? And that's something that we're working on with the Institute. But I would love to see a kind of network of trials around universal basic services with community groups spring up around the country. And I think it feels like there's a green shoots of a different way of doing things. And while if we can weave together all these different experiments, all these different ways of working, the way we're trying to deliver services alongside people in a way that empowers them. I know a lot of the work around food is moving to food co-ops, which is led by the residents that are being served. We're doing a lot of work in Camden around what we call family group conferencing, but is around communities and families solving problems together, and services being there to support them rather than providing things in a blanket way. And so if that work can come together, I think we can create a real movement for change that shows that it's practically working on the ground, it's changing lives, and start to kind of tip the balance and make the case to government that actually doing this with places and people would be really transformative in changing lives. So I'm excited about the people that have come together on this call, and some of the people that are listening, that we can start to create that movement for change.
Thanks, Georgia. And actually you reminded me, with people on the line, we also love, if you've got any projects or papers that you think would contribute to this debate, we write this up at the end, but it'd be really useful to hear from other partner organisations or councils about any work they're doing in this area, so that we can incorporate into our thinking. I can see from some of the questions there's a lot of expertise out there. I'm really happy now that Councillor James Lewis has joined us, so it would be great for him just to come in and give us a bit of a Leeds perspective. I've seen in the Q&As there's quite a lot of questions about how do you make a change at a city level when central government's not in line with you, or how much change can you make? And also there's quite a lot of questions about what would the difference look between the kind of Camden and Leeds approach. So welcome, James, and over to you for your reflections.
Thank you, Jenny, for that introduction. And it's I've been trying to digitally be in 2 places at once this morning, which is slightly easier than physically being in 2 places at once. But I thought I would end up at the opticians, if nowhere else, if I was trying to watch 2 meetings on 2 different devices at the same time. So apologies for not being here for the full session, but just to give some reflections from Leeds. And I was heard Councillor Gould's the end of Councillor Gould's contribution there, and I think we've seen the pandemic and the lockdown has shown some huge inequalities that have opened up, but we've also seen an incredible amount of kindness and support that people have shown for other people that hasn't been seen before. We've seen levels of volunteering, for example, that hasn't been seen before in some areas of the city, and as a consequence of that volunteering, people have particularly where that's been around supporting individuals and families. Some of our residents have discovered, if that's the right word to use, that actually poverty and disadvantage is in their communities around them in a way that perhaps they haven't discovered before. So I do think there is a broader sense of this being a moment for change and a sort of a re-establishment of what a basic level of service that allows people to thrive is. And I think from a perspective in Leeds, it can be for people that know Leeds. You can catch a train into the city centre and see cranes on the skyline and think this is a thriving and successful city. But we know that over 170,000 people live in relative poverty in Leeds. That's about 22% of our population. Some of the issues I heard Councillor Good talking about the welfare state are well known to us. Also on a city level, and being geographically the second largest council in the country, we see on a sort of sub-district level, when you look at some of our communities, we've seen some incredible disadvantage that is exposed. My own council ward is rural mining villages, although we haven't had a working colliery here for nearly 30 years now. And we've seen some of the disadvantages, for example, around digital connection, where when suddenly everybody needed a good quality connection at home, and we've had one small community in our ward who've been graciously informed by a provider that, well, it'll cost you about £2,000 per house for you to have good quality broadband, but if you dig your own trench for the cable, we might be able to bring that price. There is a challenge now around, first of all, what constitutes a basic level of service, and secondly, how that is provided. But I think also the costs, not necessarily looking at just from a cost base, but also how will this help us reduce public sector expenditure, both at a national and a local level, in doing so. And I think I'd be really keen to hear ideas about how we capture that moving forward. If we can, I mean, we know the figures will be the same for Leeds as they are in Camden around if older people are able to live at home rather than requiring residential care, for example, that has a huge impact. If people are living at home and able to stay safe, so they're not so older people staying safe at home and not becoming sort of regular users of the health service, that reduces the health service cost and the burden on the health service. So there are a huge number of benefits to that, and I'm really excited to hear from the seminar about how we can talk about what we want to achieve and talk about it in a really positive way, but understand how across our community and across net public sector expenditure, which as the budget portfolio holder on Leeds Council for the last 6 years is always at the forefront of my mind. And I, without wanting to mangle that famous Oscar Wilde quote, sometimes we just need to understand what we're actually positively achieving rather than just the cost of everything.
Thank you, James. I think we'll definitely come back to the discussion about kind of wasted money and how it's certainly in Camden, we found that the more human the approach, the more relational we've been, the more we've been able to free up our staff to respond as a human being. Actually, it's earlier, it's preventative, and it saves a lot of money around the kind of bureaucratic responses. And we've often talked about how perhaps we can work with Leeds and other councils again to make that point to government. We saw it through the pandemic as well, didn't we, around freedom for early intervention on things. Okay, so we can have, there's an opportunity for the panel just to reflect on each other's contributions, and we've got some questions and answers, but we've got one question here that I think really would set the tone, which is kind of a sort of a challenge around what we mean about a secure livelihood. So Henrietta, I don't know if you've picked it up, but it says, what do you mean by secure livelihood? And is everybody supposed to have a paid job, including kind of independent artists and people who prefer to care for their relatives, their communities and their environment, and who will assure that jobs are fairly paid and guarantee the autonomy of paid worker. So really, it's a question saying, you know, what's the balance between that and people making their own choices through something like universal basic income or kind of a universal provision of food. So it's quite a thought-provoking comment maybe to start off with. Henrietta, shall we come to you first?
Yes, well, that's sort of a fantastic set of questions, because it's really the whole issue all in one. And let me just have a stab at a few parts of it. So the first thing is that, you know, a livelihood is really about that package of necessities that you need to secure a good quality of life, but not just for now, but also to have a sense of what you can invest in for the future. And that investment for the future is really important to people in communities. That's a lot of the time what people are talking about. So is a job enough? Well, unfortunately, we know it isn't. So for example, in 2019, about 2.4 million people in the UK were experiencing destitution. So they weren't just in relative poverty, they were destitute. And 1 in 7 of those people who experienced destitution was in paid work. So one of the things we see when we do the work around the UK in the IGP is that there's a huge amount of in-work poverty. I mean, there's a huge amount of people who are not working, but there's exactly what Hamara was talking about, right? The Hamara situation, sorry, what Shanaz was talking about. The Hamara situation is that, you know, people don't know from one moment to the next what's happening, whether they're getting a job, whether they're getting some work or they're not getting some work. Some people have 3 jobs and they still can't keep themselves and their families going. So to have a livelihood means all the things that you need to bring together. So a lot of that is about good quality affordable housing. It's also about voice, about recognition, those sort of things that Georgia was talking about. So it's everything that you have to have. So just imagining if you had a job is enough. A job isn't enough. But not everybody will have a job or wants to have a formal employed job. So we do have artists, we have lots of other people who want to do things in communities, and they need to be supported too. But I think it's a mistake to imagine that there's some radical disagreement between universal basic income and universal basic services. My view is that the bottom 10% of the UK population are in such desperation, they just need money. Stop testing them and give them the money. That's my view about that. So we can talk more about that in a minute. But the real problem here is not just the bottom 10%, the poorest people in the UK. So it's the bottom 40% of people in the UK who no longer feel that their livelihoods are secure. They feel they're living under precarious circumstances. And for that, we have to understand that we need to provide the things that people cannot provide for themselves. Green spaces, good healthcare, good education, digital provision. You look at the situation that the Councillor Lewis was talking about, dig your own trench, right? So we know very well in the UK that there are only certain people who are told to dig their own trench. Other people are never told to do that, right? So I think the situation we have here is that we have to recognize that we're talking here about tailoring. I think Sophia said it very well. We're living in changed circumstances, and when things change, we have to respond to them. We have to move to support our families and communities in new ways. And what we're doing as we meet here today and in having these conversations is actually talking together about what we think will work. And the thing that really impressed me about Little Village and Hamara is that already we have things in our communities right across the UK that are already moving towards these universal basic services type initiatives. They understand that this is what's needed, right? They're already delivering. So what we need to do is to work out how to add value to these fantastic things that are going on, how to, you know, bring them together and add value to them, I think. So it's not about reinventing things completely in that sense, but it is about thinking about the system we have completely differently and valuing these fantastic assets we already have in our communities.
Thank you, Henrietta. Do come in, panel, with any comments or reflections.
I'll jump in. I think, I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, I would echo what Professor Moore's just said about, I think some of the issues and challenges that people are facing that we see at Little Village would be eliminated by simply putting more money in people's pockets. We're in a situation now where, you know, particularly for men, wages have stagnated for at least a decade, certainly not keeping up with the cost of living. And in the report we produced earlier this year, I was just checking the figures. For a couple with 2 children under 5, the median income after housing costs in London is £626. For that equivalent family in poverty, they would actually normally be living on £248. The difference is really shocking. That's just between the median and the actual income that families are living on. So there is a really fundamental point, whatever your views on universal basic income or not, about putting money in people's pockets. That has not been happening, and it is causing suffering. I think universal basic income, it's one of those ideas. I think we just need to try it in the same way that we're trying universal basic services and like some of the work that's happening around that in Camden. I think we're at the point now where I think we're kind of in this transitional stage, aren't we? We sort of know there's so many things that aren't working. There's so many things that have been revealed to be broken. We don't exactly know what the answers are. And when I think you're in that situation, one of the things I found myself saying a lot to the team, when in fog, hold hands, right? So we've got to advance, inch forward together, holding hands. We've got to try some new stuff. We've got to try it without necessarily knowing it's going to work. And I feel very much with universal basic income, this is one of these trials we need to start trying out in local areas in this country. I know there've been trials around the world, but let's give it a go here and see what happens. What's the worst that could happen? It's not great right now, let's face it. And the only other thing I'd add then as well is that you know, one of the things that I've really learned so much about from our work with Little Village is that, you know, the stuff absolutely matters. The pressure we're able to take off family budgets by providing them with the kit, you know, it's about 1,500 quid's worth of kit we're providing to families with newborn babies. You know, that is a huge relief for families who are really making difficult choices about where to put limited budgets on heating and rent and food and so on. But actually what people also really, really want, and what I think we have been able to provide with Little Village, and it sounds like it's what Shanaz has been doing as well with her work, is community. People need to feel a sense of belonging. I love the idea of an economy of belonging, that sense of place, belonging, connection, being seen. One of our values is love. We train all of our volunteers in how to connect with people coming through the door as fellow human beings. And, you know, I think we cannot underestimate just how important that stuff is to a sense of security as well as the income. It's both.
Jenny, can I just jump in for a second again? Just wanted to follow up on what Sophia was saying. One of the very important things about universal basic services is exactly the point she's made, and it's what we call the social wage element of it, right? So these are families on very, very constrained budgets. And here, you know, if you're providing free transport, if you're providing free digital services, if you're providing food, if you're providing housing, we've costed all of these things in the IGP and looked at all of the models. If you're providing childcare and social care. So what that means is that anything you do have, anything you do earn, you retain more of it, right? And Georgia and I were in this famous conversation yesterday evening, which she's already mentioned a couple of times. And one of the things that we were talking about is the fact that I have been arguing for ages, you know, stop paying pensioners money because they are so cold, and just do something so that they never have a fuel bill. Retrofit your housing, retrofit your housing. And when you retrofit your housing, you create a lot of jobs in the community for other people. So begin to think of the value that cascades from beginning to get the answer to the solution right.
Yeah,
so just the problem right, sorry.
Fantastic example.
Just wanted to comment quickly on the back of that, which is, I think we see that, you know, so deeply in London, that housing pushes so many of our communities into poverty, and the cost of housing in my borough is, you know, it's £800,000 basically to buy a house in Camden, and very few, well, there's almost no properties now that you can afford under the housing benefit cap in the private rented sector. So fundamentally, the only kind of source of affordable housing comes from the council or our planning policies. And that is the big driver of poverty in London. So in London, I think it's 63% before the pandemic of people who were in work poverty. And they were fundamentally in work poverty because they can't afford the cost of housing and of childcare, which are the two kind of biggest expenses. And that is what, that's what pushes people into food poverty and fuel poverty and the kind of other poverty we talk about as distinct, but fundamentally it's just people's income don't meet their cost of living. So I think that it's why it's so important that we make these basic services, as we talk about them, affordable for people, because it increases their income. But I think the pandemic has also shown the way that our whole understanding of employment isn't fit for purpose. So there are millions of people who were cut out from economic support because of their employment status. The way they were self-employed meant that they weren't able to access it, and universal credit is really bad at dealing with people with fluctuating incomes. And I think some of the kind of landmark cases we've seen this week around Uber and how we treat self-employment and the rights that we give people and the basic rights are really critical. So I think as well as this conversation, I think the employment rights, pushing living wage, and having much better employment rights for people who are self-employed is a kind of another kind of important pillar of how we work on this.
Thanks, Georgia. Shanaz, were you coming in? I think you were going to come in.
Yeah, definitely. So I think in terms of the universal basic services are extremely important, and how those services are delivered is even more important. So compassionately, with empathy. The feedback we've been given really cold. It's means tested, really, really difficult to claim. So it's really, really important that I think organisations like ourselves are inundated to deliver support because of the way that we deliver. We think family, we work restoratively, and just referring back to those 5 ways to well-being, one of them is giving. It's really good for your well-being, makes you feel good about yourself. It increases your confidence, your self-esteem, because you're giving something back. You feel better about yourself to do that. So belonging, like Sophia mentioned, is extremely important. And it's reasons why people become groomed, they get radicalised, because they are looking for that sense of belonging. And if we can provide that in our community settings, it's a step up. So universal basic services are extremely important, as well as the universal basic income. If we can give the security of having the service and the support there, having that income of being able to pay myself for my bills, my rent, my food, that as well builds confidence in the individual. By us just paying everything and providing the service, we're not increasing budgeting skills, we're not empowering individuals to manage their own money and give them the choice of where they want to spend it and spend it sensibly. It's our responsibility in the community to be able to provide that support to individuals. And then, the system, the welfare system makes the individuals be stuck in there, because say, for example, if your gas cooker's broken, your fridge is out, you're going to have to take a payday loan. How am I supposed to pay that back if I don't have the income? We have a lot of individuals who are in a lot of financial debt that need support. So for me, I feel like we need a combination of both, as the service as well as the income.
Thank you for that. I've got a couple of questions that sort of follow on a bit from that. I think they're particularly probably for you and Sapphire, and then perhaps Georgia and James can give the kind of counter response. It says we know that community networks play a critical role in securing people's livelihoods. How can the public sector work together with informal and formal community activity to create an effective system? So how can we work together whilst maintaining the strength of the different cultures to help that you find in the community-led activity? So I think they're asking us, how do we do this well? And I think it was to your point and earlier Sapphire's point about one of the problems with the welfare state is it assumes sort of a homogenous group of people, that you're responding to, and Georgia mentioned as well, you know, that the health service is able to respond more personally. So whoever wants to come in, I don't know if Shanaz, you want to kick off on that, but
yeah, I think services, a lot of services lack providing that wraparound service and support. So if someone's come for you for support, and if you can't provide, if you recognise another need, another complex need, we need to signpost and refer. It's really, really important that we work collaboratively and provide that wraparound service. So the council has many, many directories. If you're calling up one service, and if you recognise, you need to have that conversation, build that trust, recognise where the individual is at, and people who are working in these services need to be trained to be able to pick up those kind of key skills of where they can recognise what additional support might be needed, ask those key indicating questions, and build that rapport and that relationship, build that trust empathetically and compassionately, to be able to refer and signpost to other directories and other teams and other departments, so that we are providing that wraparound service and thinking family, working family. So we're providing support to the whole family and working holistically, and not just dealing with that one issue, because you can waste a lot of time by making that individual, referring them to another line, and they have to go through the whole situation all over again. It's traumatic to say it once. Why make the individual say it again and again and again? Provide that support, provide that wraparound service, make that referral, speak to your colleague in the different team and say, I've been working with this individual, I've picked this, this and this. Can you support with this? Can you refer them on to here? We need to work collaboratively and collectively to make the systems work. We can't do it alone.
Hear, yeah, no, I just couldn't agree more. One of the things we describe our work as, we set out to be a kind of first line of defence, which is not a role that Little Village does alone. We do it together with all the other frontline organisations and grassroots organisations and cooperatives and everything that we're working with. And, you know, one of the beautiful things about working in Camden, we're based in a community centre in the south of the borough, STCA, the Summerstown Community Association, and actually between all of the work they do and the wealth of support and community services they offer, and then what we're able part of a network, a safety net, you might even call it, but you know, that is there to provide that infrastructure for the community to support one another, to look out for one another. So I think that is so important. But I also just want to say something. I mean, I think it's a great question that came in, and that kind of question of how does kind of public sector and how do public services work with community groups. I think one of the things I've been thinking about in preparation for this morning is that, you know, there is a bit of a risk when we talk about services. I think we need to get really clear. I think there's something quite implicit in what Professor Moore was talking about and what we're discussing here. A particular kind of service, a service that is very embedded, very local. Actually, though, I just want to take us back. Services have not escaped the creeping hand of the market. And you know, actually, in my, you know, I've worked in and around this stuff for 20 years. You know, the relationship between public sector and charities 20 years ago is very, very different to what it is now. Now there's a kind of commissioning relationship. You know, as a voluntary sector organisation, you're sort of having to prove that you can hit certain KPIs and targets. It's sort of like, you know, efficiency is the name of the game. This is not the route by which we're going to build human-centred services. And so I think we need to kind of say, you know, let's just be careful. Not all services are the same. If you think about the food and the free school meal stuff that Marcus Rashford kicked off on Twitter, you know, that was a service, you know, but look at what the result was. Children being sent, you know, cucumbers and carrots are being cut in half. So there's something about the way in which services are delivered which is really important here. And I think part of this discussion, implicit in it, is an idea that when we talk about services, they need to mutualise. They need to provide value locally through meaningful, well-paid employment. They need to provide a sense of place and opportunity for belonging, and that we kind of take out these very extended and distant sort of supply chains that are part of what many services are today. So I just wanted to make that point. Kathy Evans from Children England talks about a beautiful thing, a new contract of interdependence. And that's the relationship I think we need to be seeking, not this kind of commissioner and contractor relationship between public sector and voluntary sector, but a declaration of interdependence. I'd like us to go towards that.
I love that phrase, and it fits with what we were talking about earlier. And how we speak with our residents. There's a lovely phrase about coming to every conversation as equals, and it picks up Shanaz's point about the importance of people bringing something and contributing, so that and the love point. These aren't conversations where we're just giving something out. So there's some questions here that I thought perhaps Henrietta, Georgia and James, you might want to pick up as part of the call to action. There's been quite a few questions about what are the limits of what cities can do on their own, or boroughs. How much can we impact and change prosperity on our own, and what do we need to do to sort of change central government? So I know we touched on it in the presentation, but who'd like to pick this up? And for Leeds, there's also quite a few questions on what does prosperity look like in Leeds that's perhaps different from Camden? How do you get the local difference?
Just on the question of what you can do locally, I think we can do a lot locally, and I think it builds on what Sapphire and Shanaz were just saying. I think we as councils are kind of trying to shift the way we work with community organisations, and move that to be more of a relationship based on trust and shared endeavour. And the pandemic brought a lot of that out. So we started to kind of wrap our services around community organisations. So Age UK had very strong relationships already with older people. We provided staff, we deployed staff from other areas, transport to support. And add more kind of logistics to the trust and relationships they had with older people, which meant we were able to deliver much more quicker. And I think we were having this exact conversation with some of our partners yesterday. I can see Sarah's in the chat, and she was there, and it was talking about exactly this challenge about how we as a council use our resource to kind of to add more value to the local links and relationships that are being built up, and the work we can do around data and ensuring that kind of we're equity and recognizing need, but investing in those organizations that have the best relationships and ensuring that they're joined up. So I think we do, as local authorities, have huge convening power, and we also spend a lot of money, even though we've lost half our budget. I think we do have a significant amount of spend. So I think if we can kind of have a strong sense of shared endeavour and work together to transform things, there is real power that we can achieve in local communities, and the kind of pilots that we've talked about. But we can't solve all of this, because there's just not enough resource in the system, even if we do combine all of the health and other resources, which would make a real shift. So there was a question about how do we actually make this happen. I think what I'd love to see from the Department for Work and Pensions is to just really work with us on some clean sheet pilots. Like, we're going to take a place, we're going to take a group of people, and we're going to work completely differently, and just see how that works, and test and try new models of doing this. And actually, this pandemic and the issues around social isolation are a perfect opportunity to do that, because what we're seeing is people are not able to self-isolate because of precarity, because they are scared that if they're not at work for 2 weeks, they will lose their jobs, and they will not be able to get work back, and they won't be able to feed their children or make ends meet. And so we are seeing the public health crisis exacerbated by this kind of poverty. So even us really working together on what a kind of inclusive social isolation kind of package of support would be, could start to be the kind of green shoots of something new. So that would be my plea, to just try it, to trust us a bit, try something that's a bit different, which rather than sees people as trying to trick you or as a problem, to see them as people with strengths that you trust, and see if that has a completely different result, because I'm absolutely certain it will.
Great, we're getting some volunteers for pilot work in the chat box as well, which is brilliant. James, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I think the question I'd like to address is, what does prosperity in Leeds look like compared with East London? And I think, to me, the answer to that is probably very similar, actually. You know, it is about giving people a safe home and the opportunity to thrive. And we may start from, in lots of different areas, we may start from a different point as a English regional city and suburbs and outlying areas to part of London, which is a alpha global city. I can't think of a different way of describing it. However, I think the fundamentals of how people thrive, I think are fairly similar. Like I say, we may be at a different starting point on some of those. You know, a big thing for me is access to jobs and what transport options we give people to have access to jobs. I'd love a London-style 24-hour bus network that means that people are able to accept jobs and are not limited by a public transport system that might only run from 7 in the morning till 10 at night, and things like that. But like I say, that's I use that as an illustration of where we start from a different point. I don't think the end point we want to get to are that different, and I think this is a strength of the work with Georgia and Camden, is around sort of understanding actually to make this work. And there's always the accusation that gets thrown at the public sector around we're providing a postcode lottery or there's favoured areas or things like that. Is being able to do it, being able to do this in a genuinely universal way. But like I say, I think that the end points are probably going to be the same, and that's that for me will be my answer to that question.
Thank you, James. And I wondered, Henrietta, I know we're doing that thing where we're getting close to the end, but it's a perfect point at the beginning. We talked about us all developing our secure livelihood strategy and this kind of call to action. And in the chat bar, people are saying, how do we get this started and what do we do? So I didn't know if you wanted to have a last word on what needs to happen and what we should all, our call to action.
Okay, well, okay. So first of all, we are getting it started. We've started in Camden. We're going to be doing a Camden-wide prosperity index very soon. A second one coming in Newham in London very soon after that. We'd love to do one in Leeds. We're going to do one, we're talking to Liverpool about doing one, and also to Glasgow and so on. So in other words, I think the important point that Councillor Lewis made was that there are many things that are shared, but there are also very many things that are different. And I think that Shanaz made that point very well at the beginning. People have complex and multiple needs. And we need to understand, in an economy of belonging approach, we need to understand that people's history is important to them. Where they've been, where they've come from, where they want to go is part of that story. And you can't ignore that. So when you talk to people about the good life, you have to understand you're talking about diverse versions of the good life. And those need to be not just respected, but built upon. Right? Diversity is our great strength in this regard, but there does also need to be issues around equity of provision and so on. And these are things which we need to discuss and work out. That's why experimentation is so important. But for example, provision of transport is absolutely crucial. People refusing to, not able to go for an interview for a job because they can't afford the transport to get there, right? Many people paying a huge amount of the money they earn on transport every day, going backwards and forwards from their job. Terrible figures on mental health and mental stress from the distances that people have to travel. Impossible circumstances for our nurses in London, traveling an hour and 3/4 in the morning and an hour and 3/4 back at night to deliver care that we all need to have. So we have a fundamentally broken system where we don't seem to be able to, we have the values, we all have these values. The question is, how can we begin sharing them? So first thing is, have these conversations. Second thing is, experiment locally. Make sure and work out what works, which is already happening because we have Little Village, we have the Mara, we have all these fantastic things. Let's build on the knowledge that we have. But exactly as Sophia was saying, these things have to be delivered within a different value framework. And they have to crucially be connected to other actions at the local level. So just as I was saying, if you're going to provide housing for people so that they don't have to have a fuel bill, that is a universal basic service, right? But it has to be connected to green retrofitting, which connects to your carbon net zero goals, which connects to your new jobs for other people and so on. So there is a lot that can be done at the local level, but you will also need a change at the national level in terms of national attitude, national policy making. It isn't just a matter of devolution, it's also thinking about what is the purpose of the economy and the way it's being run. And ask yourselves, do you think the economy is being run now to deliver quality of life for all people in the UK?
Thank you, Henrietta. Tom, I know you're going to try and wrap this up for us now, so do come in.
Thanks, thanks, Jenny. I've loved listening to the discussion, and I always feel these sessions are a bit of a break from the battle that we've all got, and it's really good to sort of have a bit of space to think about things in a bit more depth and reflect on the things that unite us, but also the things that are different in our challenges. It's almost impossible to sum all of it up really in a few minutes, but Dame Professor Henrietta, set out at the start such a compelling set of issues about how we couldn't repatch again from Whitehall. We can't rely on trickle down. We need to redefine prosperity, ditch old metrics like GDP, because it's now the bottom 40% who are feeling precarious and the bottom 10% who are hugely challenged in where we go next, and the calls to action around a radical rethink of public services, experimentation and local universal basic services being at the centre of that, but very collaboratively. And I think that followed on really well with Shanaz and Sapphire about how, the solutions that you've both been finding. I love the idea of holding hands as you're walking through the fog. The very compelling restorative approaches that, Shanaz talked about as well, that have made the most difference, but also the sheer demand that we're seeing from people and the crisis that a lot of people are in, and that massive insecurity day to day, where you don't know, where your next, job's going to come from, where your next bit of income is going to come from. I would just, one of the things that I would add in there as well is mental health, knowing the mental health agenda quite closely myself. If you add mental health into the mix, where somebody's feeling precarious themselves, where maybe the member of the family is having an episode which is sending the family into crisis, that adds that sense of just complete crisis that we need to get behind and do something about. And it was great to hear from Georgia and James, about what's happening, about that commitment to have those conversations as equals, to almost try and rethink how we've got into this position, where, as Georgia said, we're almost running a shadow welfare state in many ways already. But how we, councils do inject that feeling of empathy, kindness, love, belonging, and working with the third sector that no one else can really, and the issue of opportunity that James flagged up around things like the extra volunteering, digital connectivity. So what a rich discussion. Where we go next, I think, is to, as we've said before, we'll circulate a lot of these the agenda for the day to people who've attended and listened in. Thank you so much for doing that and for your questions, which were really, really fascinating. I think we will try and pick up and look at where there are common threads that we could run with. One that really appeals to me is the family group conferencing. If you don't know about that work, it's basically, rather than, someone once described it to me as, you used to go in as a family in crisis, and it'd be like an away match, a sports event, a football match, where there'd be 10 people who were professionals and 2 of you, and you flip that round to being about, it's 10 members of the family and 1 professional, and it's how can the family you know, sort some of their own problems out themselves on their terms in a very, you know, sort of equal way. But equally, what can the state do to help, if you like? What can we do to help? And if we could add in housing, you know, food, support on food, you know, these wider wraparound of services to those conversations, that is our way in to these families on their terms in a very restorative way. So thank you once again for everybody, all the panelists, and Jenny for chairing so well, as I predicted she would, and also to the team behind this who do loads and loads of work to make this work so well. And it's been brilliant, and a real step forward in my understanding and thinking about this. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. And I'll leave you now with 2 minutes over, but that's not bad for a Thursday. Have a great rest of the day, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.